come all, gather round, boils and ghouls, gather round. Join me for a tale, the tale of an odd little movie in horror history. Yes, this is the tale of Freaks. After finding success with the 1931 version of Dracula, Tod Browning was considered a talented director, and audiences everywhere were watching with bated breath to see what twisted delight he'd produce next. But regardless of having a talented director behind it, Freaks still received some pretty heavy backlash from minute one. Reportedly, MGM production chief Irvin Thalberg described an early draft of the script as horrible. And things only got worse when studio executives saw the performers that were being cast for the movie. Studio head Louis B. Mayer even tried to shut the picture down. It was only through sheer determination and the studio's confidence in Browning as a director that this movie managed to get made at all. And why is this? What is it about Freaks that made it such an unlikely movie to get made at all? Well, you see, my pets, this was the first major Hollywood production to feature a cast of differently abled actors. And it's a horror movie that largely depicts these people as the villains. We'll get into that further in just a little bit, but for now, let's keep talking about the film's reception. When this movie was first screened, it initially ran over 90 minutes, but it was so poorly received by audiences that it got cut down to just over 60 minutes before its wide release. The full 90-minute version of the movie is believed to be lost forever. During screenings, one woman even threatened to sue MGM Studios, blaming the movie for her miscarriage. Critics panned the movie largely due to its cast. For instance, one review published in Variety claims that the story does not thrill and at the same time does not please, since it is impossible for the normal man or woman to sympathize with the aspiring midget. And only in such a case will the story appeal. Please excuse my use of what I know to be a slur. I only thought it necessary to use to explain the dialogue that surrounded this movie at the time. And I do not think it can be overstated just how large a reaction people had to the idea that these types of performers were being used in a Hollywood movie. It wasn't only the studio heads and the general audience that reacted with disdain. It was literally everyone. Studio executives were so openly disgusted by the cast that they refused to eat lunch with them, forcing all except for the Little People actors and conjoined twins Daisy and Violet Hilton to eat in a separate tent. Writer F. Scott Fitzgerald, who worked for MGM Studios at the time, claims to have gone to the lunchroom one day and saw Daisy and Violet Hilton eating lunch. At which point he became nauseous and had to leave. Bit of an overreaction, but what else can you expect from the guy who wrote the definitive jazz-era party novel? That is what The Great Gatsby is about, right? Extravagant parties? That's what I got from the Baz Luhrmann movie anyway, and I don't read books, so... The original cast for this film included Jean Harlow, Myrna Loy, and Victor McLagan, all of whom dropped out when they saw their co-stars. And even the actors that did wind up in the film weren't necessarily the most respectful. For instance, Olga Baklanova, the actress portraying Cleo, described meeting her co-stars in the following quote: "Tod Browning shows me little by little, and I could not look. I wanted to faint. I wanted to cry when I saw them. They have such nice faces. They are so poor, you know. He takes me and he says, you know, be brave and don't faint like the first time I show you. You have to work with them." It was very, very difficult first time. Every night I felt that I am sick because I couldn't look at them. And then I was so sorry for them that I just couldn't. It hurt me like a human being. I've been saying all of this to explain the dominant discourse around this movie back when it first came out, in the 1930s. MGM Studios defended themselves against the backlash, essentially by congratulating themselves for even daring to put differently abled actors in the movie to begin with. They hailed the film as being the most daring production of all time, and that narrative hasn't really gone away. Years later, this movie was still being praised for its boldness and shock sensibility. And in the early 1960s, it gained a massive cult following. Throughout the 70s and 80s, Freaks became a popular movie for midnight screenings. It has been parodied by The Simpsons. It served as inspiration for the Freak Show season of American Horror Story. And it was even included in the reference book, 1001 Movies You Must See Before You Die. But let's not forget what I mentioned earlier. This might be the first Hollywood movie willing to portray differently abled performers. But at the same time, this is still a horror movie that casts these performers as the villains. And that fact wasn't lost on the performers that appear in the movie, many of whom went on to express shame at their involvement. And in all of this, there is one term that I've been building up to, something that is still relevant to the modern day. Let me see if I can say this. It's a really long word. Representation. Hey, I got it! Representation of differently abled people still isn't perfect. In a lot of cases, such as the 2018 film Wonder, differently abled characters are portrayed by able-bodied actors in makeup. A step back from what Freaks did, by the way. To this day, disfigurements tend to be represented in one of two ways. As a sign of villainy, or as something sad and inspirational. Neither of which permits viewers living under these conditions to see themselves represented as real people with depth and humanity. In fact, pretty much the only sign that I can think of that we've made any progress since the days of Freaks is Game of Thrones' Tyrion Lannister. A genuinely sympathetic character played by real-life little person actor and charming motherfucker Peter Dinklage. At least I don't hear mass audiences denouncing Game of Thrones because, to return to the review from Variety, it is impossible for the normal man or woman to sympathize with the aspiring midget. So, with all of that considered, and because I am the hostess obsessed with horror history, I don't necessarily see anything wrong with going back to the beginning and asking, what the fuck was up with Freaks? Well, after an opening longer than some of my videos, let's get into that now, shall we? The movie opens up on a traveling circus, where a sideshow barker is trying to lure people in, telling them all about the freaks they're about to see. He talks about them like they're fairies or elves or some other sort of separate species that lives by rules of their own. A major theme of this movie is that us versus them mentality, strengthened by this idea that as a persecuted group, differently abled people will form a bond that everyone else should know better than to cross. Which, on the one hand, I'm sure there is some truth to it. When you are persecuted by the dominant culture, it tends to make you seek out a community of like-minded individuals who know exactly what you're going through. But at the same time, this movie could talk about them a little bit less like they're monsters or something. And Anyway, the Barker takes the crowd to see the first freak in the roster. A woman screams at the sight of them, faints, but we don't get to see them. We only hear the Barker begin his story about how exactly the circus came across this freak. Enter flashback. We see a beautiful trapeze artist named Cleopatra, Cleo for short, performing while she's being watched by two other performers, Hans and Frida, both little people. And look, I know that it's a big deal that this movie cast actual little people for this role. It's great, fine, yay for representation, woo. But Hans and Frida are supposed to be a couple, but they're played by real-life brother and sister Harry and Daisy Earls. What? Could they not find two little people who weren't related for this role? Or at least change the script so that we didn't have to cheer for this weird incest relationship? Like, the only reason why their relationship matters is to explain why Frida is concerned for Hans throughout the movie. But couldn't she have been concerned for him if she was just his sister? This is weird. Anyway, why is Frida concerned for Hans? Well, because Hans is making it blatantly clear that he has a crush on Cleo. Because Hans is a massive dick who doesn't appreciate the fact that he already has a gorgeous woman more devoted to him than he deserves. Honestly, Frida is such a sweetheart, and she deserves so much better than some fuckboy who can't keep it in his pants. Move on, girl. Move on. Although, I will make a note here. Despite what some reviewers working for Variety might say, I do believe the movie intends for us to be sympathetic to both Hans and Frida. This movie weirdly lacks anything as structured as, you know, protagonists, but these two come about as close as anyone. So anyway, Frida looks on sadly for a little bit while Hans flirts with Cleo, and Cleo flirts back. Shortly after this, however, we discover that Cleo is in a very dysfunctional relationship with the circus strongman, Hercules. She cries to the clown about her boy troubles, and he responds by telling her that all women are tramps who waste their lives on the wrong man until they're too old for anyone to want them. But don't you worry, in between all of that woman bashing, we still get all of the good old-fashioned making fun of differently abled people that you would expect from a movie called Freaks. For instance, we get to listen to this one douchebag explain why differently abled babies should be murdered before they get a chance to grow up. That's pleasant. Lots of fun bullying towards the intersex performer Josephine Joseph. From this point forward, I'm gonna try to stick mostly to the plot, but just know that these little slice-of-life moments are kind of interspersed throughout the whole movie. Sometimes it isn't even bullying. Sometimes it's just the circus performers going about their day. Subplots are the name of the game when it comes to this movie. Outside of the constant bullying, we also get to see the conjoined twins, Daisy and Violet, as they struggle with the fact that Violet doesn't get along with Daisy's new fiancé. Chicks before dicks, Daisy, that's all I have to say. The bearded lady gives birth to a baby girl. And apparently, the bearded lady doesn't have a name because nobody refers to her by it throughout the entire movie. And then we just get to watch, like, just random segments, like the torso lighting a cigarette with his mouth. What is the point to all this? I thought this was a horror movie. Okay, fine. I'm not gonna play that dumb, even though I really want to. Yes, I know that the majority of the horror in this movie is meant to be derived by the simple existence of these people. We're supposed to see the torso lighting a cigarette with his mouth and be repulsed by, well, you know, him, which is incredibly exploitative and sad. But it also means that a lot of the horror of this movie has been sanitized with time. I don't find these people disgusting. The thought of the conjoined twins getting married doesn't shock and thrill me. So instead, I'm just caught watching these little slice of life dramas with characters that I'm not particularly invested in. But anyway, back to the main plot. Or sort of. There is one little slice of life moment that I wanted to talk about first, but it is sort of related to the main plot, so it isn't meandering, I swear. So Cleo and Hercules make up, and I have to admit, enticing a lover into your caravan by saying, "Would you like anything to eat?" would be a very forward pickup line. If I wasn't pretty sure that she was actually talking about food. They start kissing, at which point Hercules notices that Josephine Joseph is watching them. He confronts the intersex performer, who at this point has stopped watching them and started to apply their makeup. Hercules says, "Now here's something for your eye," punches them in the face, and Cleo just laughs. As a fellow tiny androgynous person, I felt that. After Hercules abuses his co-worker with absolutely no repercussions, we then find out that Cleo has started dating Hans, because he regularly delivers expensive gifts that she can share with Hercules. I have no idea at what point Hans broke up with Frida, but I assume he did. Another reason why it probably would have made more sense to make them brother and sister, but whatever. Regardless, Frida's still an absolute sweetheart about everything, worrying about Hans with the neighbors, even though the bastard couldn't keep his dick in his pants. Seriously, you could find a better man if you threw a stick. I mean... Excuse me, this is my show, darling.
Don't you think the unfortunate subtext of the film and the reason why so many of the subplots revolve around women who are attached to undeserving men is because they feel like they don't have any other option? They aren't quote-unquote normal, and therefore they feel like they have no other choice than to settle for the first man who will take them, even if he is gross and unpleasant.
Sure. Or the subtext could be, gross freaks need to stick with their own kind at all costs. Now stop being so faux deep, you dumb slut, and let's get back to the plot, okay? Anyway, Frida pays Cleo a visit, asking her to leave Hans alone because everyone in the circus is laughing at him for being in love with an able-bodied woman. Cleo mocks Frida with the possibility of marrying him, claiming that she would actually marry him on the simple basis that it would be just so weird. Beautiful Cleopatra marrying a little person. At this point, Frida reveals that no-good, lying, cheating son of a bitch Hans has come into a large inheritance, which is how he's able to afford so many expensive gifts for Cleo. Wait, the boy is loaded? No, that still doesn't explain why Frida is so devoted to that asshole. She can still do better. Anyway, because Cleo and Hercules are the absolute scum of the earth, they decide to do what we all knew they would with this information. Cleo is going to marry Hans for his money and then kill him. There's a big wedding scene in which Cleo and Hercules act like drunken idiots and make out in front of her new husband. Come on, girl, take it from a pro. If you're gonna do the whole Black Widow thing, you need to be sneakier than that. Things take a turn for the worse when all of the differently abled performers decide to show their acceptance of Cleo by chanting a totally not at all creepy "one of us" over and over and over again. This makes her freak out and yell at everyone, after which Hans finally starts to suspect that there might be something off about his new bride. Not that it matters, because Cleo has already started the process of slowly poisoning him to death. But this is a turning point for the other performers in the circus, who start to keep a closer eye on Cleo. And by that I mean that they act the way that any normal adult would. Creeping under caravans, hanging out in dark corners, cleaning their weapons, you know, the usual. Things reach a head when the circus is on the move, and the performers decide to confront Cleo and Hercules to have a mature, adult conversation about what they suspect is going on. No, I'm lying, of course. Instead, they castrate Hercules and they mutilate Cleo, turning her into the freak that the audience saw at the beginning of the movie. Okay, to be fair, the 60-minute version of the movie doesn't actually confirm that Hercules was castrated. That was one of the things that they cut due to negative audience reaction. Really, I just wanted to bring that up because I like saying the word castrate. But the real horror of this movie is still to come, when we see that Frida accepts Hans back after everything. Girl, what the hell? Do we have to return to my favorite word here? Anyway, on that note, final thoughts. This movie is odd. I do think that it is an important part of cinematic horror history. And it most certainly was an interesting step in representation. Say what you want about the fact that the majority of the differently abled performers are meant to be villains. Hans and Frida, at least, are the protagonists, and they're meant to be sympathetic. And yes, there is plenty to be said about the fact that they are normatively proportioned and traditionally attractive. But regardless, this was a huge step for Hollywood as far as representation goes, and I don't think that this movie deserves to be forgotten because of that. But, that being said, how much does any of that matter if the only thing that people remember from your movie is, one of us? Why are you looking at me? I don't know, I'm not a scientist. All that I know is that this movie had, like, no blood, guts, or sex, and that makes it a complete waste of my time. Now, if you'll excuse me, thinking is hard. And I've done more than enough of the brain thing today. Time to go put an ice pack on my poor head.